Hello and welcome to another Python tutorial. This video is going to link back to the previous tutorial on lists, so we're going to use some of the information from that and we're going to be adding to it. So I'm going to open idle as usual, make a new file, and I'm going to copy a list that I have in a separate file on my other screen. And this list is quite large, the second one, so I'm going to put it over a couple of lines so that it fits on the one screen, so we can see this more easily. And let's just hide the output for the moment. So I have a simple list called score list. It is a list because it has the two sets of brackets, there are commas in between these numbers, and the numbers are simple integers. And this is a score list. I've called it score list because the idea is that perhaps in the program above or in a separate program we have a game, let's say where there are 15 questions, and the players will answer the questions, get 1 point per correct answer from the questions, and then at the end, once they've finished, they'll be told their score, and then their score will be added to this list so that others can see how they have performed and people can play against each other. So this is a very common sort of implementation in any sort of mobile games or apps. If not stored in a list, the information will be stored in a database. A lot of the apps use databases, but we are not going to look at anything that complicated so far, so I am just going to store this in a list. Now the next natural step up, if you are playing a game and you've got a high score, then you probably want to tell people about it. So in the second list I have added the player's name as well as their score. But you will notice that there are two sets of brackets here, two sets of brackets here, and there are brackets in between these, and that should actually have a comma there, otherwise it won't run. So I have one list here, I have a second list here, a third list, and so on. So there are actually 6 lists inside this larger list. And this is called a 2D or two-dimensional list because there are lists within the larger list. And these lists have both strings and they have integers. So I have the player's name and the player's score. So we can look at a couple of things with these lists. We can, if we want to sort the list so that the player with the highest score is at the front of the list. So if I, let's say, print score list, I'm then going to do score list dot sort, which is a function in Python, and then I'm going to print score list again. And when I run this, I will have to save it as always, and I'll just call it adding to list for now. We can come up with a better name than that. And I have an error, and this is very common. I have misspelt something. So score list is not correct. It is in fact score list. And I'm going to keep this in because errors are extremely common. It's a simple typing error. I can read the error, figure out what it is, and we can just run it again. So you'll notice the first time this prints, it is the same list, 5, 10, 8, etc. The second time I run this, the list has been sorted, but it has been sorted into ascending order. So the player with the lowest score is actually at the front of the list. Now this isn't ideal. If you want to say print only the first 3 scores after this, then you're going to get the lowest 3 scores and not the highest 3 scores. So to fix this, we're going to go back to where it says score list.sort, and I am going to type in reverse equals true. So this is a variable that the sort function can take it can be sent a variable, and we're setting the variable to be true before it is sent to the function. And when I do a video on functions, this should make a little bit more sense, but at the moment all you really need to know is that this will reverse it so that it goes into descending order. So when I run this again, you'll see 15 is now at the top or the front, and it goes in descending order. So if we were to say pop the first 3 numbers out of this list, then we would get the 3 highest scores instead of the 3 lowest, which we were getting before. So again, a simple function which helps quite a bit if you're doing something like this with lists. Now, as I said in the previous video, you probably don't want to print the whole list. You could, if you want, just print the first item in the list. So we get the highest score, which is just 15. In this case, we're just printing the top one. We could print the first 2 or 3 by doing this, but in this case, if we do it like this, we get these annoying brackets and the commas as well. So if you print this to the user and say that the highest 3 scores were this, then the user might be a little bit confused as to why there's brackets and commas in there. So what you might want to do instead is loop over this list and then print the first 3, or we could alternatively pop the first 3 off, store them in a variable and print them that way. But I am going to show it this way just so that we can see how you might loop over a list. So for the start, I'm just going to say for I in and then the name of the list, and all I'm going to do is print I. So what this is saying is basically grab every item from score list and print it. So any integer, that is why I is used in this case. If it was a string, we could use C for character, etc. But in this case, we're getting integers from the list. So for each integer, each number in the score list, we're just going to print that number, and it will print them one at a time, and it will print all of them at the moment. So in this case, we have all of the numbers from the list printed one after another. And we could, if we wanted to, add a message so that we could say the score was, and then if I want to use the plus to add an integer to the string, I have to use str to convert this. I could use a comma instead, but I will do it this way this time. So if I say this, then it will say the score was, and then a number each time. We could add a different message for different scores, all sorts of things. But this prints all of the scores. Perhaps we only want to print the top 3. So instead of saying for I in score list, which gets every one, and then we can only just print each one in turn, we have no way to know whether it's the first one, the second one, etc. when we're doing the print statement. We can say for I in range len and then score list. So what this does is it finds the length of the list, which is the len function. So it gets the length of the list and then it passes that to the range function, and effectively this means start from 0 and until you hit the number that is range, we're going to continue this for loop. Now if I do this and I print I, you will see the number starting from 0 up that is stored in here, not the actual list item. So I starts at 0 and increases until it hits the length of the list. It does not actually print the items from that list. So we see 0 to 12, so there are 13 items in the list, including the one in position 0. That doesn't actually help us because it doesn't print out the list item. If we want to print the list item, then we have to print the list and select the element we want, and the element we want to print is the number that we are at in this for loop. So this will print the numbers that are stored in the actual list. So we're back to having 15, 14, 10, etc. down to 1. And the benefit of doing it this way is that instead of saying for I in range the length of the list, we can just say for I in range of 3. So this will pick up the first 3 items of the list and print them out. So here we have 15, 14 and 10, and we could very easily add a message. We could, for instance, even say if I is equal to 0, then we're going to print you are top score with, and then this time I'm going to use the comma as it saves a bit of time, and I'm also going to print the other 2, but we'll just print their number so they don't get a fancy message. And in this case, the person at the top will say you are top score with 15, and then the other 2 just say their number. We could make it a little bit more exciting so they get their own message, say second place is 14, third place is 10, etc. But as you can see, I'm using the variable here, which is the step counter for the loop, to work out what position in the list they are in, and that way I can say you have a top score, or you are second place, you are third place, you are fourth place. If you just do for I in the list without doing in range, then it is a lot harder to then print out a message to say this is second place, this is third place, etc. So this is just an example, different ways of doing similar things, and it shows you that you can loop over a list. So we can loop over the items in the list and print them out quite easily, and we can also add some if statements in and do something a little bit more exciting with these lists. So now I'm going to move on and show you the second list, and we can print this out if we want to, and we get the full 2-dimensional list. Now in this one, if we want to print a element from the list, we can actually print a full list. So if I print, say, element 0, then this actually prints a full list. It has Barry and 8 inside. So printing the list element 0 or position 0 gives me this whole list. And if I change this to, say, number 1, we'll get the second list over, which has Jane and the number 3. So again, we can see that this is a 2-dimensional list. There are separate lists within the list, and asking for one positional argument actually returns a full list rather than an individual string, integer, or something else like a boolean. Now if we want to access an item, let's say within this first list, so position 0 of the larger list, then we need position 0, and then we can add a second positional argument, and I'm going to choose position 0 again, and this will get the first position from the list which is inside the second list. So this can get a little bit confusing, it is a little bit more difficult, but we are accessing the first item from the first list from named high score list. So this should print out Barry. And if I change it to the second position from the first list, like so, we should get the number 8. And just to demonstrate that this can cause problems if done wrong, I'm going to ask for the second, or well, third position from this list, and it will not go to Jane. It will just tell me that does not exist. So it says list index is out of range. In other words, this number 2 here does not exist. There is no third argument in this list. I could add one in and say hello, and now if I print it, it will say hello, but before there was no third positional argument in this list. And again, if I want to, I can change it so I can print, let's say, the number 3 for Jane. If I get the position of Jane, which is 1, and the position of the 3 within this list, which is again 1, then it will print the number 3. So this is very useful because you can store lots of data in one list. You can have many lists inside a larger list. It's very efficient for storing data, and the data can be accessed relatively easily once you know how to call these positional arguments. If you were storing this data for a game or a mobile app, then in all likelihood you would put this data into a database rather than just a list within Python, but you might want to put it in a list in Python before you send it to a database, depending on the application you use. But seeing as I want to keep it as simple as possible, we are simply doing this with a list in a Python script, no databases or anything like that. So now I want to perhaps print the high score list, but I want to have put it into order first, and I want to put it in order based on this second positional argument within each list. So I actually don't want just one number to move around a list, like this one, the 15 went to the front. I want an entire list. I want this list with Jessica and 15. I want that whole list to go to the front of this list here, the second dimension to the list. So in order to use this, I'm going to use a slightly different function. Instead of sort, where we had to do scoreList.sort, I'm going to use sorted, where sorted actually takes the list and a few other arguments. So I'm going to use this line of code, and I'll go through it briefly, but this is the sort of thing that you end up Googling if you don't know or don't remember how to do something like this. Then you can just Google how to sort a two-dimensional list based on the second position, or sort two-dimensional list Python, and you will get all sorts of tutorials, Stack Overflow and other things like that on how to do this. So I won't go into the detail in exactly how this works, but the sorted function takes in a list, and in this case we're using our two-dimensional list here, the named high score list, and then we can set a key for the list to be sorted by. So this list will be sorted based on the key. I won't go into too much detail on Lambda on this video, but Lambda is effectively an anonymous function, so you don't have to fully define the function to use it. And all this is doing is saying, can we please set the key so that it uses the second item or first position of each list within this list. So we're taking the list and we're not using the original list, L. We're going to be using the first position from that list, and that is going to be grabbing our number to use for the key. We then still need to use reverse, and reverse is going to be true so that it is in descending order instead of ascending order. You can run this function without that. This is an optional variable or an optional condition that you can add in, and if you don't use reverse, then it will come out in ascending order, so lowest to highest, whereas I want highest to lowest. And if I then go to the next line and I print our list again, then what should come out is we have the list printed in ascending order. So we have Jessica on 15 first, Charlotte on 13, and so on, which is absolutely what we would want if this was a game keeping track of high scores. So instead of printing these, we can do something like for L in named high score list. So I'm using L because this is a list we're going to be grabbing from named high score list. So I'm going to be printing each list, and I'm going to print L, which is the list. So this will print the full list, and it will print them in descending order. And when this has been run, we see that this has in fact printed the full list in descending order. So we've got Jessica and 15, Charlotte and 13, and so on down the list. Now, as we did last time, I will change this to for I in the range of the length of the full list and print it that way, because I want to set a certain message to each player. So we can say, for instance, the person's name and then the score that they've got, rather than again printing the full set of brackets, commas, and the apostrophes, because this can be a little bit confusing for the user. So I'm going to change this again, and instead of using for L, because L was for list when we were printing full lists, this time I'm going to write for I. So for I in range, we're going to get the length of this list, and again, if we wanted to, we can just print the list with the current position that the for loop is on, and this will do exactly the same as what we just had. It will print out the names and the numbers in the full view like that, but we don't actually want that. We perhaps want to print a set message for the top 3. So again, I'm going to change this to just the top 3. Unfortunately, the others haven't made the cut, they simply weren't good enough, and I'm going to add in some if statements to show how this could be useful. So we're going to say if I is 0, so if they're in position 1, then we're going to say the name, which is position 0 of the first person, and I will always start at 0 if you set up a for loop like this, unless you tell it otherwise. You can actually change the start position of I to another number, but if you don't set the position of I, it will always start at 0. So the first person in the list, the first part will be their name, and this will be Jessica because we've ordered the list from highest to lowest. And I'm going to add a nice message. So we could say Charlotte is first place with, and then we can add the second part, and this will be a long line, and we can add the second part, which is the number. But because I'm using it this way and I'm using the plus signs, we're going to have to convert this to a string, because we know for a fact that that is going to be a number. This position is going to be a number. And if we were doing this fully and making it as complicated as possible, you might actually want to put some checks in here, a try except block, because if you think this is a string and it's actually a number and you try using these plus signs, you will get an error message. So you could, in theory, do it without the str, but this will print the player's name, will say their first place, and then it will say their score. And then we can add, if we want, just the word points at the end. And I'm going to leave that as is, and then I'm going to say else we'll just print a name and their score. So the others don't get a nice message because I don't feel like typing it out. And before I run this, I will need to add some spaces into the strings, otherwise it will look a little bit messy. And I will actually add an empty string to this one to make it look a little bit neater. So when I run this, the first person will get a nice message, the second 2 will just get their name and score, the other 3 at the bottom don't get anything. Unfortunately, they didn't make the cut. So I run this and it says Jessica is first place with 15 points, Charlotte 13, David 9. So at the moment this just prints the first place with a nice message and then the second 2 places. if we wanted to make this slightly easier on ourselves, so rather than saying if I is equal to 1, say their second place, if I is equal to 2, then say their third place, if we want to get rid of the if statements, then what we could do is write this. So I'm going to delete all of this, and instead of saying is first place, I'm going to change it to just is, plus we're going to convert the integer, which is I, into a string, and we can say rank there. So is rank the position of the for loop, or the integer within the for loop, add another plus and say with, and this will say their score and their rank. So when I print this out, it will say Jessica is rank 0 with 15 points, Charlotte rank 1, David rank 2. Now again, to the user this will look really weird because they're ranked 0, so we have to be mindful of that. So to fix this, all we need to do is add 1 to the variable I as we're printing it, and this won't actually affect the variable in here. It won't break the loop will run perfectly fine, but we're just adding 1 when we print it so that it looks neater for the user. So this will now say Jessica is rank 1 with 15 points, Charlotte is rank 2, David is rank 3, and so on. And if you wanted to, again, we could change this to the full length of the list. I chose the top 3 people to begin with just to show that you can select within a list, so you don't need to print the whole list. You can select how many items you want to print, but you can, if you want to, print out for the whole list. So again, if you were making a game where you want to keep track of everyone's scores, you might only want to print out the top 3. Each time someone else plays, then their points get added up, gets added to the list gets resorted, and then we can print out their names again. And this is actually something that OCR quite like to ask for. In the old GCSE specifications non-exam assessment, OCR were constantly asking for some kind of high score list, and they actually asked for it to be stored in a separate file and added to and accessed each time. But you don't necessarily have to store it in an external file. You could store it in a list within Python, and exporting that list to a separate file and re-importing it to print out each time is fairly straightforward anyway. So it is very useful to know how to do things like this, because if OCR are willing to ask you to do this in a non-exam assessment, which they've now disbanded, they've removed it from the specification, then they could ask you to do this sort of thing in an exam question. So they won't ask anything as complicated as perhaps wanting to sort the list, but you might need to know how to write a for loop to run over a list, even if it's just the for I in the original list, print each item out of the list. That is something that they could ask in an exam. It's nothing sort of too strenuous that they would feel that that is too complicated to ask for. So this is very worthwhile knowing, and even without being useful for exams, it is useful for all sorts of applications anyway. I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you, and have a good day. Goodbye.